From our studios in New York, here again is Stone Phillips.
We all like to feel we have some control in our lives over what we do, what we say, how we act. Well, the man you're about to meet knows just how important that can be. He's a professional athlete used to being in control of his game. So what would spin him out of control, doing things others found bizarre, making them concerned enough to have him committed to a psychiatric ward? His struggle to find out would take every ounce of courage and become an inspiration to millions. Here's Rob Stafford.
Meeting a sports star. Kids across America dream of this moment.
Come on over here, guys. Come on over here.
But these children share more than a love of baseball with outfielder Jim Eisenreich. They share a common challenge. Because of how he handled a medical mystery that baffled him and his doctors for years, Jim Eisenreich represents hope to these kids. Hope that someday they too can achieve their dreams.
One of baseball's truly great gentlemen, Jim Eisenreich.
Jim's story isn't really about sports. It's about a man who was blessed with the talent to play, but seemed cursed by a condition that nearly killed his career. It began a long way from these sunny ball fields in the snowy farm fields of St. Cloud, Minnesota. Jim Eisenreich grew up the third of 5 kids. The little lefty learned to love baseball while he was still in a high chair. He says he was a normal kid, except for some strange symptoms that no one could explain.
When did you first realize there was a problem?
I think in first grade. And what it was for me was a lot of eye blinking and some, like I always had a cold, an ongoing cold.
Eye blinking he couldn't control, and a cold that wouldn't go away soon led to behavior that baffled Jim's mother, Ann.
We always eat our supper together. And he couldn't sit quiet. He would stand up and jump and stuff like that. And so we knew something was wrong with him, you know, that way.
Jim also had a tendency to sweat the small stuff, obsessively.
That was one of my things, was to wash my hands a lot. If I got any kind of dirt on my hands, I washed them and dried them off. And also, if I came along and saw any of the kitchen cabinets open, I'd always shut them.
At school, he felt shut out, jittery, uncomfortable in his own skin. He'd snort, make faces, and had a hard time paying attention. Teachers accused him of disrupting class.
16, 24, 32.
He felt like a kid out of control.
I always had the feeling that the rest of the class had their eyes on me. I didn't want to be the center of attention, but I felt like I was.
One day your dad asked you, "What's wrong? Why are you doing this?" What did you say?
I broke down crying and I said, you know, I can't help it. I don't know, you know. And he said, well, we're going to try to get you some help.
When he was about 8, his parents took him to a nearby hospital for 4 days of medical and psychological tests. Was Jim physically sick, or was it something psychological? The Eisenreich family says doctors told them it was just nerves or hyperactivity making Jim so miserable. He'll grow out of it, they said. The problems waxed and waned, but he did not grow out of it. So the family tried to ignore the mysterious mannerisms. But of course, the kids at school could not.
Were the kids cruel?
Some.
Did they call you names?
Well, they called me Snorky because I snorted. You know, I was a mental retard. You know, I was a lot of different things.
Snorky, retard, jiggly, twitchy. The names hurt. As he grew up, Jim felt people were staring, making him even more ill at ease with himself and others.
I had no self-esteem, no confidence. You know, and I had my own little world in sports.
Sports were the sole solace for Jim, the only arena where the painful problems seemed to vanish, and Jim could feel comfortable, confident. The kid who couldn't concentrate in class could keep his eye on a fastball. So he focused on getting to the next level. He played baseball in college, trying to push away the problems that plagued him off the field, but never fully trusting the doctors who had called it nerves or hyperactivity, and always worried, was this all in his mind? On a June day in 1980, Jim got a phone call that changed his life. The star from St. Cloud State had been drafted by his home team. After 2 years in the minors, the majors, and a chance to make a life for himself in the one place where he wasn't bothered by the bewildering symptoms.
In center field, Jim Eisenreich, Minnesota Twins.
But the dream soon turned dark. Just weeks into his first season, at a game in Boston, Jim began shaking uncontrollably and gulping for air. The press and the nearly 14,000 people in the stands saw Jim suffering what seemed to be a seizure or a breakdown. Many Fenway fans were brutal. Bleacher Wolves said the press.
Hey, come on now. Hey, here we go.
Jim's former teammate, Mickey Hatcher, now a coach for the Dodgers, was there.
Being out in the outfield, I could hear some of the stuff that they were saying, and really it was like a guy getting ready to go into an epileptic fit.
Fenway Park, some of the people were described as vicious in what they said to you. Shake for me, Jim. Somebody called you a freak. Vicious.
I never heard that. I guess I was so scared and so embarrassed for myself that I just had to get out of there, and it wasn't because of the fans.
I want out.
Oh, definitely. I'm saying, please, Lord, help me. I don't know what I'm doing. Please help me get out of here.
It was the worst he'd ever felt, more than any time before, out of control. The game went on without it. But he flew with the team on to the next game in Milwaukee, still anxious, twitching, and having a hard time controlling his breathing, and worried it was more serious than the Twins' doctors could guess.
The air was pretty smooth, but I was pretty turbulent. It was probably the longest ride I ever had.
You get to Milwaukee, and you can't go into the game.
I had to go out for batting practice where there's no people in the stands, and I couldn't even walk out to the field.
Were you scared?
Terrified.
Of what?
I guess of dying. Passing out or whatever. I didn't feel like I had any control of myself, which I didn't.
Team doctors still didn't know what was wrong, but they didn't think it was a life-threatening illness. They gave Jim a sedative for what they described as rookie stage fright. Then they asked Mickey Hatcher to take Jim to the hospital. Hatcher feared it was more serious.
I really didn't think that he was going to be able to catch his breath. He was shaking so much, he thought he was going to die. He actually told me that I think I'm going to die, Mick.
In the emergency room, Jim got more sedatives, but says nothing seemed to work. He stayed secluded from the public and the press. When the Twins returned home to Minneapolis, a team trainer drove Jim right from the airport to the hospital and had him admitted to the psychiatric ward.
I knew something was physically wrong. I knew I wasn't crazy. I just knew there's something I couldn't control. And when I couldn't breathe, that's not something that I felt was psychological.
Was it all in his head, or was Jim really ill? Would doctors ever be able to figure out what was wrong?
When we return, Jim's extraordinary search for answers and for help.
I was a walking pharmacy, trying everything in the book for 2 days here and 2 days there. And if it didn't work, I'd try something else.
Dateline, honored by American women in radio and television with 3 Gracie Awards, more than any other news magazine, continues. Now from Studio 3B, Jane Pauley.
Returning to our story, Jim Eisenreich has been hospitalized for mental problems, desperately trying to find out about strange symptoms that put him there. But he's convinced the mysterious medical condition is physical. It's a problem that has troubled him since childhood and now threatens his dream of a career in the majors. Here again, Rob Stafford.
It had been 15 years since the first time Jim Eisenreich was hospitalized for tests, but still no answers as to what exactly it was that continued to plague him. Now at 23, he spent 2 weeks in a Minneapolis psychiatric ward, and then nearly another year and a half as an outpatient, treated with sedatives, anticonvulsants, antidepressants.
I was a walking pharmacy, trying everything in the book for 2 days here and 2 days there. And if it didn't work, I'd try something else. And I felt horrible.
He was in the team photos, but he was out of the game. Except for a couple of comeback attempts that left him so frustrated that at least once he walked off the field in tears.
As the saying goes, there's no crying in baseball. And here you are in front of all these people and you're breaking down.
Well, there's been a lot of crying in baseball. You know, I didn't like the feeling I had physically. I thought, you know, here I am again, and it wasn't worth it. No, all the money in the world wasn't worth going through that.
Before he'd even played a full season in the majors, before he could make a name for himself, Jim had to retire from the game he'd loved since he was a boy. He moved back home with his parents. When he wasn't seeing doctors, Jim passed his time playing ball for the local tavern team. But the pain of not knowing what was wrong was unbearable.
Your brother told us that he remembers hearing you crying in the room next door after your retirement.
I was probably on my knees praying, you know, Lord, what am I going to do? You know, what do I do now? I've left the game I love. You know, I want to be normal. That was my goal in life, was to be normal.
But how could he be? He didn't even know which diagnosis to believe. By then, he says he'd had 10 to 15 different opinions since he'd first showed the strange symptoms as a boy.
I can't tell you what they all are, but they're some are pretty ridiculous. I had a negative birth experience, whatever that meant.
A negative birth experience?
Yeah, that's totally ridiculous.
They wanted to put you into a tub of water and have you breathe through a snorkel and relive your birth?
I guess.
Baffled experts had also urged Jim to try hypnosis, meditation, and biofeedback. But still, no one was sure what was the matter.
I don't know what biofeedback really is, but I know it. I came out of there thinking, how's that going to help me play baseball?
Desperate for answers, he saw a new doctor, one who was especially interested in the symptoms that had bothered Jim since he was a boy. Could excessive blinking and a seemingly permanent cold in a nervous kid have anything to do with the debilitating agony Jim was now experiencing as an adult? The answer was yes. Finally, after more than 15 years in the dark and more medical exams than Jim could count, the mystery was solved. Had you ever heard of Tourette's syndrome?
Never. And I thought they were saying tourist syndrome.
Tourist syndrome.
Tourist syndrome, yeah. Because I traveled. That's what I thought they meant. Seriously.
What Jim has is Tourette's syndrome, an inherited neurological disorder. Scientists think it's linked to an imbalance of dopamine and possibly serotonin, two important chemicals in the brain. The result is that people with Tourette, like Jim, have tics, gestures like excessive blinking, or sounds like snorting they can't control.
If a tic's going to come and happen, it's going to happen, no matter where you are or what you're doing. Something in your brain is telling some part of your body to move or to make a noise.
Okay.
Jim's symptoms are very subtle today, unless you look closely. There are approximately 100,000 Americans diagnosed with full-blown Tourette syndrome. Tourette has been in the medical books for decades, but it's sometimes hard to diagnose because symptoms can vary over time. Experts estimate there are many more people living with milder symptoms unaware they have Tourette. But many with Tourette, like in this 1994 documentary, have symptoms much more debilitating than Jim's. To this day, there is no way to test people for Tourette, but it's not a life-threatening condition. Lowell Handler, author of a new book about his life with Tourette, says that many people with Tourette, like Jim, can be obsessive-compulsive and have difficulty paying attention. But Handler argues there's one myth that especially adds to the stigma of Tourette syndrome.
I think the biggest misconception about Tourette is people thinking that everybody who has it swears.
Hard-ass bitch!
In fact, only about 10 to 15% of people with Tourette have that symptom. Jim does not. There is no cure yet for Tourette syndrome, but there are drugs that can help people live with the symptoms.
Eisenreich mashes it.
And when Jim found the right drugs, he was ready to get back in the game.
A standing ovation at Royal Stadium for Eisenreich.
Nearly 6 years after he was hospitalized in a psychiatric ward, Jim made a triumphant return to the majors with the Kansas City Royals. Since then, he's played in 2 World Series for the Philadelphia Phillies and the Florida Marlins. Since his comeback, Jim's life outside the stadium has been on the upswing, too. The man who says he didn't have his first date until he was 27 fell in love and got married. He and his wife, Leanne, have 3 children who show no signs of Tourette. But because Jim knows how valuable early diagnosis could have been for him, he and Leanne watch the kids closely for symptoms. And Jim now uses his sports star status to help other kids who have the disorder.
Did you feel like you were hopeless?
To soften the stigma and to create confidence, Jim meets dozens of times a year with kids and grown-ups with Tourette and their families.
The more you can accept it and believe that you will be successful, I guarantee it'll happen. I want to take it upon myself to create awareness for these kids and give them some kind of hope for the future. I'd rather see them have a good upbringing and a better chance at sooner success than what I had.
Do you look back on those days and want to say to people, you should have figured this out?
No. If you try to fight what the good Lord's plan is, you're going to have a tougher time, I think.
Today, Jim is less concerned about his life back then and more focused on the future for generations to come. Certainly, knowledge about Tourette syndrome has become more widespread since Jim was a boy. And many think it's because of Jim.
Do you think you've made that difference?
I think I've helped.
Jim was traded last month. He's playing for the Los Angeles Dodgers now. And you can find out more about Tourette syndrome on our website. The address is www.dateline.msnbc.com.